Welcome to the lecture recital of the fourth semester at Suburban College. My name is Gavin Chow. I'm the music department chair and also the chairman of the Department of Fine Arts. And today's recital features our music faculty, Professor Henry Dickhoff, and he teaches jazz piano and organ here. And the title of his presentation is Harmonic Devices in the Compositions of Cedar Walton. Professor Dickhoff has piano studies on a classical track, receiving multiple awards from the National Guild of Piano Teachers and the International Piano Duo Competition. After discovering jazz in high school, he was admitted to the renowned College of Music at the University of North Texas, where he served as a teaching fellow and received his bachelor's degree and master's degree in jazz studies. After graduation, Henry toured the United States, Canada, and Japan as pianist for the world-famous Glenn Miller Orchestra. So before the program ends today, we will have a few minutes for Q&A, so feel free to raise your hand and ask him questions. Without any further ado, let's join me to welcome Henry.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for coming. Thank you, Dr. Chow, for the introduction. I'd like to thank South Suburban College for having me give this talk today. And you might be wondering, what were you listening to while we were waiting for this to start? Of course, that was a live recording by the Cedar Walton Quartet featuring Clifford Jordan on tenor saxophone. Probably heard some tenor in there. And nothing we like more than a live recording by an old band like that at a now defunct jazz club. And that jazz club is called, or was called, Boomers, somewhere on the East Coast. I don't quite remember where. So that's a lovely portrait of my man Cedar Walton on the Blue Mitchell recording session, Boss Horn, in 1996, photo by Francis Wolff. He was really an impresario of the jazz world in the 1950s, 60s, and worked a lot with Blue Note Records. Why are we talking about Cedar today and not Oscar Peterson, Art Tatum, someone else? So something that I really admire about Cedar was that he prided himself on being a sideman. He worked with a number of very famous artists, and from things I've heard from people that worked with him, they said that he was always humble. He could be in the spotlight as a leader, but he prided himself most on being a sideman, which I think is a wonderful quality in a jazz pianist. He was an innovator during the hard bop era. What's hard bop? Well, if we take the bebop era that started in the 1940s and 50s, people like Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, they were the main pioneers of the bebop style. And then directly after that, starting in the late 50s, early 60s, this other subgenre of jazz began called hard bop, which took the elements of bebop, its sort of complex language, but then it added more blues and kind of driving rhythms, shuffles, backbeats, things like that. I think that's where they get the hard part, whereas bebop is a little kind of lighter and more, well, it's different. And something that we can say about Cedar is that people respected him equally as a composer and as a pianist, as a performer. If you think back in history about your favorite musicians, how many were revered equally for their compositions and their playing. Usually people are kind of stronger in one or the other. They dedicate themselves to get better at one or the other. But he was really respected by all of his peers for both of his contributions. Yes, and there's a new book. It's been released in the past few months here. It's called Cedar, The Life and Music of Cedar Walton. I have no affiliation with this book. After, if you'd like to take a look at it, feel free. And Ben Markley is a pianist and professor at the University of Wyoming. He released this book, like I said, a few months ago, and something that I love about this book is that it's not just a biography where Ben talks about Cedar's life the whole time. He, at least half the book, if not more, is interviews with people that played with Cedar, and they provide their personal perspective on what Cedar did, what they meant to him, things like that. And so I just became aware of this book, and the timing was really perfect. I heard about this book. I was asked to do this lecture recital, and I thought, well, we have to make it about Cedar Walton. And finally, this person, Jamie Aebersold here, he is a saxophonist and is more known for creating play-along tracks since probably the 60s or the 70s. He would create play-along tracks for musicians to play on their horn, usually along with a rhythm section over a particular song. And in this case, volume 35 of these books, of these play-alongs, featured exclusively the compositions of Cedar Walton. And more than that, Jamie hired Cedar and his trio to be the backing track. So if you want to practice Cedar's tunes, you can right along with Cedar and his trio. I think they recorded that in the late 70s, early 80s. And all of the lead sheets, all of the sheet music that you're going to see in this presentation is from that book directly. And there's a bit of a, there's always a discussion in the jazz world about how much we trust a particular source and how it writes out compositions of our favorite jazz composers. Often we have kind of a pessimistic view and we say, well, this chart isn't right, this is wrong, this is wrong. But I find that these Aebersold lead sheets are extremely accurate to everything I've experienced. And again, the fact that Cedar had to sort of give his blessing for Jamie to release the book tells me that they're accurate charts. To give you a brief bio about Cedar before we get into some music, he was born in Dallas in 1934, and he died in New York in 2013. He had a long life, which unfortunately many of our favorite people from this area did not have such a long career. He bounced around a couple schools in the South and then eventually landed in college at the University of Denver, where he completed a music undergrad. And I've always felt a certain connection to Cedar because I grew up near Denver, and then I went to college near Dallas. So I felt like we were two ships passing many years apart, obviously, but I've always felt kind of a personal connection with him because of that. Like many musicians, he moved to New York in the mid-50s. New York is still thought of as the place to go if you want to get to the highest level of playing jazz. And at some point in there, he served in the Army and met Chicago's own Eddie Harris, a great tenor saxophonist. And in this book I mentioned, it goes on to say how the fact that Eddie and Cedar met while they were in the service, that really led for them to have a wonderful career playing together after that. And so how awesome that two jazz legends could meet in the service, and then once they were done, they were able to continue playing and working together. He made his recording debut with Kenny Dorham in 1958 on an album called Kenny Dorham Sings and Plays. It's a relatively straight-ahead, kind of friendly recording, but you can definitely hear Cedar's sound in there that he would continue to play with for nearly 60 years, right? So that's a nice recording. He really made his bones, so to speak, when he played with Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers in the 1960s. That, I think, is really what put him on the international map, and many people became aware of him because he played in Blakey's band. He contributed a number of compositions to that band. Blakey was big on people bringing their own tunes to the band. And I think even a couple albums, the title of the Blakey album is one of Cedar's compositions. So his influence was definitely felt there. Finally, he had what was called the Magic Triangle Trio in the 70s and the 90s, originally with Cedar on piano, of course, and then Sam Jones on bass and Billy Higgins on drums. Many people felt that they had this magical chemistry of playing together. And so if you imagine, there's a bass up here, a drum set up here, make this triangle, and people said it was really magical. They just had a wonderful way of playing rhythms together, and that's just one of the greatest trios this music has ever seen. And it was especially important because of the decades that they were so popular. In the 70s, that's when the whole fusion movement came about, and that trio stuck playing typical piano trio that, again, we would associate with the hard bop kind of era. Which harmonic devices are we going to be looking for in this presentation? We'll be looking for pedals. So, not like the gas pedal in your car or the pedal on the piano, but instead the idea that we keep one note the same in the bottom and we change what's going on up top. I was delighted to learn that recently, learn that composers going back to the classical era have been experimenting with this idea of keeping one note the same on the bottom, changing things up top. So certainly not a new thing, but something that you see throughout Cedar's compositions. Chromatic progressions. This is something, like I was mentioning, started kind of in the bebop era with the language, meaning the melodies that they played in the bebop era. But then I would say in the hard bop era with Cedar's compositions, he put that chromatic movement into the chords as well. So it wasn't just up top in the melody, but also the chords and the bass movement. Finally, the relationship between these blues or pentatonic-based melodies and how they fit with the chords. We have a very generalized way of talking about composing in jazz, which is to say there's kind of two ways to do it. You can have a simple melody with complex chords, or you can have a complex melody with simple chords. And I find usually with Cedar's tunes, he has a singable, familiar melody, but the chords are kind of where the spice is. Let's do every jazz musician's favorite thing, which is to say, let's start with the blues. In each one of these songs, I have the lead sheet here. If that means something to you, feel free to look at it. If it means absolutely nothing to you, then just listen. So we're going to start with Cedar's Blues. Here we go. Thank you. So, why is this one of the songs we picked today? Chromatic triad turnaround. Wow, that sounds a little wild, doesn't it? If you look starting at the third system, you'll see that there are these major triads going down chromatically by half step, and that, I don't know if I've ever seen that in another blues song. Again, to me, this is something that is uniquely Cedar, and all the while this chromatic thing is going on, you'll notice that underneath it says pedal F. So you keep the F going while you play all these triads, and then it goes down by step on the fourth system where it says pedal E flat. So this is a very cool turnaround, and by turnaround we mean what we play at the end of the blues form to get us back to the beginning. So there's those triads and the pedal, and in addition, what does this little motive create in the form? It creates what we call a form extension. So when we think of a blues form, traditionally it's 12 bars long, 12 measures, but at least on the melody to the song, Cedar made it 16 bars, which again is not commonly done, but there's nothing that says that that can't be done. And so then when you go to improvise, if you notice the part where it says solo, parentheses, blues, you make it a standard form and you just play over 12 bars at a time. So that's something that jazz musicians like to do. We will make the melody to the song, the beginning of the song, we will make a modification on it, extend the form, something like that. But then when we go to improvise, we kind of rein it in and make it a little more simple to us. So it's just B flat blues, and the name, is very fitting, Cedar's Blues. So that's the first song we're going to talk about today. Now we're going to probably Cedar's most well-known song, most played, Bolivia. So perhaps imagine you're in a South American country. And for the people who are more on the theory buff side, I'd like you to think while I'm playing what key this song is in. Notice that there's no key signature included, which is intentional, but just because there's no key signature, maybe there still is a key. We'll talk more about that. But hope you enjoy Bolivia. Here we go. Bolivia. I guess it sounds like South America. I don't know, I've never been there, but maybe one day. So, let's talk about the introduction to the song, which can sometimes be turned into a vamp when you perform this. Vamp meaning you just loop a section. So the intro is the first line. It's a 4-measure phrase that you repeat usually 4 times for 16 measures total. And that's just a lovely G7, it says, but there's a lot of things that you can put on top of that, and that's what is potentially so freeing about playing the same chord. So it says G7, and you play it 16 bars, or you vamp it, you play it as long as you want, and in that time, you can stick to kind of the chord for a while, and then you can go off and do something else. And that's one of the beautiful things about these repeating phrases in jazz music. Tritone substitution to G major. Let's break that down a little bit. So if you look going into the third system, where it says Latin, it says a G major chord there. And so basically, tritone substitution, if you want to go from one chord to another chord, that's a 4th away. In this case, we're talking about the D major, skipping a measure, and then G major. So from D to G, that's a 4th. What you can do is you can approach the G major from a half step above it. So if you look at the second system at the end, where it says A flat 7, that's your tritone substitution, and then it resolves to the G major there. And if you notice, going from A flat to G again, that's that chromatic kind of language that they started to include more in this era. And it just creates for a little bit of different sound. So maybe I'll play. If you just do D major, D7, G major, that's what, this is what that would sound like. That's all right, but if we do it as it's written with this substitution, suddenly it sounds much more like jazz and less like other types of music. And another interesting part here is if you look in the end of the third system, where it says C major, the melody there, it's very familiar, and there could be any number of chords that you could put under it to harmonize that melody. And it's interesting to me that he chose to do B minor, and then go up to C major. That's not a progression you see very much in these types of tunes, but as we'll see in a moment, it was something that Cedar used in a number of his compositions, where you have this minor chord, and then you go up to the C major. That's amazing. Finally, another tritone substitution here, if we look on the 5th line, where it says swing, we see that we have an F major, some other chords, and then a B flat major. So there's that same root movement again, F up a 4th to B flat. So you could have done F7 in the second bar, so this is what that would sound like. But that doesn't sound very good at all. So instead, we can do a tritone substitution in that second measure and make it B7. And then resolve So again, it's using these substitutions as a way to make the chords sound more uniquely jazz and not pop, or what I like to call jazz adjacent, meaning styles that are close to jazz, but not quite jazz. Okay, and now this is a song called Firm Roots. I believe the title goes to something about the band at the time, feeling like they were very kind of rooted in the way they were playing, that they were playing well together, and here we go. That one's tough to keep going. Pedals abound. So built into the melody itself, not just an intro or a vamp like on Bolivia, our last song, you'll see that there's just pedals all over the place in the song, and it's a wonderful way to make, again, a simple melody sound more interesting. If you didn't have the pedal there, if you were changing the roots of the chord with each melody note, it would sound a little more kind of restricted and not as creative, I guess I would say in a general way. And it's just a really, really fun tune to play because of all that space. Stepwise walk up in the B section. So as the chart's written a little strangely, but if you look on the fifth system here, on the F minor, it goes F, G, A, B flat. So walking up by step, basically, that's a sequence, more or less, that he's taking the same melody and moving it up by a fixed amount. And that's a great way to sort of break up the pedal nature of the song, because the beginning and the end are just pedals all over the same bass note. And then this part specifically is a little walk up to sort of relieve that. And I love the big chords to end the song. In jazz, we speak very generally to mean small chords, meaning chords that only have a few unique notes, like a triad would have 3, we would call that a small chord. Whereas these ending chords here, the E flat minor over A flat and the C minor over F, it's at least 5 or 6 unique notes. So we would call that big chords. This is a wonderful waltz by Cedar. You'll notice that it's in 3/4 time here. And I think the title clockwise has something to do with the harmonic movement, with the way the key centers change. So see if you can hear how it feels like a clock moving back and forth. Thank you. We have another intro vamp that is relatively simple, going back and forth between E major and F major, which is an interesting combination, not one that we normally see. And I might call it harmonic major, if you had to think of a scale that would fit over both chords. Harmonic major is an interesting sound. So the clockwise part of the title, how does that relate to the tune? Well, starting on the melody, the key centers go down by half a step. So it starts in E major, and goes down E flat, D major, D flat, etc. And it's a really brilliant way of getting through different keys in one song. And he does it very simply by starting in one key and then just doing the 5 of the next chord. So E major, and then he does the 5, E flat, B flat 7, etc. We have another one of my favorite things going into the bridge, another tritone substitution to A major. So how do you precede A major? B flat 7. A nice chromatic movement down from B flat to A. And I guess that's all I have to say on that one. To finish today, I'm going to be playing Fantasy in D, also known as Ugetsu. So to be clear, Fantasy in D is Cedar's title for the song, so that's correct, obviously. And then Ugetsu is a Japanese word that means something vaguely close to fantasy, and I believe that was the term coined by Art Blakey when they were playing that tune in his band. And this is one of those tunes. There's an Art Blakey album called Ugetsu, maybe recorded in Japan. So here we go. Fantasy in D. Again, another intro and vamp, a pedal. Hopefully we're starting to see some patterns here. And this is the song that to me explains what key Bolivia is in. I was saying before, Bolivia doesn't have a key signature written, but perhaps there's a main key. And there are some progressions he uses in both songs that are identical. The tritone substitution we already talked about to G major, A flat 7 to G major, and then also that move of B minor to C major, those exist in both songs. And to me, that's what tells me that Bolivia is probably in the key of D major, although I would entertain other ideas as well. The turnaround into the A section is chromatic. It's different between how they play it on the melody versus how they play it on the solos, but it is still chromatic in both cases. So if you look here, the bass goes G, G flat, F, E, E flat, and then back to D. So it's all the notes you can possibly play in the bass in between G and D going down by half step. And then on the solo section, they play B to E, B flat to E flat, which then E flat resolves back to D. So again, that half step resolution is just everywhere in these songs, and makes it fun to play. And then there's a pedal to end the form on the solos, which is the opposite of Bolivia. Bolivia, you start the solos with the vamp, and then you play the changes part for the second. This is flipped. When you solo, you play the changes first, and then you play the pedal last. To end today, I just wanted to leave you with some of my favorite Cedar recordings that maybe you'd like to go home and check out. It's never been easier to find these recordings. I must say, even when I was first starting to check out this music, you literally could not find some of these recordings. You'd have to find the original vinyl. It was very difficult, but I'm sure you can find all these very easily. So, the aforementioned Ugetsu by Art Blakey, 1963, that's really the peak year for that group. Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers, Cedar on piano. I believe that's Wayne Shorter on saxophone, Freddie Hubbard trumpet. So, just really household names, as we would say. Eddie Harris, we talked about him at the beginning, Chicago's own. The In Sound, Cedar is on piano, and this is an important record because it's the first time Cedar met the great bassist Ron Carter, and they would go on. Ron would end up replacing Sam Jones in that Magic Triangle trio I mentioned after Sam Jones passed. And this is just one of my absolute favorite recordings. I just love it so much. Dexter Gordon, the great saxophonist Tangerine from the 70s, again, keeping that acoustic sound going in the middle of all this electric music that was going on in the 70s. That album is funny to me because what's the album cover? It's a picture of a tangerine. So they thought for a while on that. An album with Cedar as the leader called Eastern Rebellion. Again, I think this relates to something about them playing a lot in the East, like in Japan during this time. And that's just a wonderful recording, really kind of the peak of Cedar's albums where he was the leader with his groups. That's when you have to check out. A duo album called Heart and Soul. They play the tune Heart and Soul, and it's very kind of sweet, and it's intimate. It's a nice chance for the two to interact without anybody else. Finally, a solo album. Pianists love listening to solo piano records, so here's one. Blues for Myself, released in 1986. I think we did it. We did it. Any questions? Yes?
So earlier you were inferring that you've met some people that have worked with Cedar Walton. Is that true?
True.
What did they have to say about him?
So the person I know the best that worked with him is a drummer in Chicago named George Flutis. He worked with Cedar in the 90s and the early 2000s. And my favorite anecdote, and George is talked to in this book, so you can read what he has to say for pages and pages, but my favorite story is that apparently when Cedar would drive, in Turkey specifically, he would drive like a madman. He would drive on the sidewalk, because that's what you do in Turkey. And so George talked about being scared out of his mind in the back seat as Cedar's driving onto sidewalks in Turkey. He had wonderful things to say about Cedar's musicianship too, but that's the story that has stuck with me. Any other questions? I don't bite. Yes?
I'm interested in when and how you got interested in music.
So, I started when I was 8, taking classical piano lessons. That's where that classical track came in that was mentioned in my bio. And I was lucky to have really supportive parents and teachers that believed in me. But unfortunately, I didn't have the passion for classical music. I was good at it, but I didn't really love it. And then I discovered jazz in high school, and then I've been focusing on jazz ever since then. Anyone else? Sure.
Of these songs that you played today, which is your favorite and why?
Good question. I would say with a group, like with bass and drums, maybe a horn player, I really like to play Bolivia and Ugetsu because there's so much you can do on top of those pedals. I think for solo piano, I really like Clockwise. It's written in a very pianistic way, and it's not difficult to translate it to just piano, whereas I think Bolivia and Ugetsu are more written kind of with a full band in mind. So my answer varies depending on what the instrumentation would be. What else? Yes?
How long did Cedar perform for that time?
So as far as I know, it was mostly in the 70s and the 90s. It was sort of interrupted again when Sam Jones died. I think he died in the late 70s, early 80s. The group kind of never picked back up from that. There are things written by Cedar where he thought of Sam Jones as like the best bassist in the world, and he had difficulty kind of moving on from that. So Ron Carter subbed in the group, or started playing with them in the 80s and 90s. They had David Williams on bass. And then when you got into the 90s, a lot of people that were born in the 30s and achieved great success, they kind of fell out of the public eye, unfortunately. And at that point, that was when those people started leading their own groups and hiring more local musicians. So I mentioned the Chicago drummer George Flutis. Cedar kind of disbanded the Magic Triangle group and then started doing hiring more local people. Like George at that time was kind of in his 20s or 30s, so hiring younger people. So that was a long answer to say 70s through the 90s.
Were there recordings or were they for live performances?
They did absolutely everything. I mean, they have recordings where it's just the trio and you can hear exactly what their sound was about, but they also would be hired as a trio to back up other artists. So whether it be a vocalist or a horn player. The Eastern Rebellion is a great live example of that band that has George Coleman, I believe, is the tenor player. So you can hear how the trio interacts with someone standing in front of them. To me, that's kind of the best recording for that group. Last question. One more? Anybody? Yes? would say no. There are some people that, like myself, who play piano and organ. The way they play both instruments is it's sort of complementary. Like what they play on the piano could be played on organ and vice versa. Whereas the things that Cedar did to me are super pianistic, and most of the things kind of cannot be translated to organ. So I think more of organ players and horn players, like tenor sax usually when I'm playing organ, and I don't think of someone like Cedar because to me it's very pianistic the way he plays. Thank you all so much for coming.